I do want to read a few verses to you to introduce our study this evening from 1 Samuel 28, beginning at verse 7. Then said Saul unto his servants, Seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said unto him, Behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. And Saul disguised himself and put on other raiment, and he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, I pray thee, divine unto me by the familiar spirit, and bring me him up, whom I shall name unto thee. And the woman said unto him, Behold, thou knowest what Saul hath done, how that he hath cut off those that have familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore then layest thou a snare for my life, to cause me to die? And Saul sware to her by the Lord, saying, As the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen to thee for this thing. Then said the woman, Whom shall I bring up unto thee? And he said, Bring me up Samuel. If you're looking for drama, you're not going to find anything in fiction that's any greater and more gripping than this narrative here in 1 Samuel 28. I mean, you've got a witch, and she's in a cave, and you've got mighty King Saul in disguise, and they together are in hopes of conjuring up the spirit of the prophet Samuel from the abode of the dead. I want to give you just a little background tonight. You remember that Joshua is the one who led the children of Israel upon their successful conquest of Canaan. And after several signal victories, they declared the land theirs, and they divided the territory among the various tribes and sub-tribes of Israel. And they formed sort of a loosely formed confederacy. Now, this was not a kingdom. There was no king, but it was sort of a loosely formed confederacy. It was based upon the fact that they worshiped a common God. They had a common place of worship, Shiloh, and they had common enemies on the outside. And the confederacy lasted about 200 to 400 years, and it was led by various judges, men such as Samson and Gideon, and this is what the book of Judges is all about. Samuel was the last judge in Israel, and he was the first prophet after Moses of Israel. And I'll give you the conditions at the time in Judges 17 and verse 6. In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Well, after an illustrious 40-year career as a great leader and a prophet, there was a delegation of people that came to Samuel and told him, You're an old man, you're out of touch, and we want a king like all the other nations have. And they were tired of being ruled by a prophet in the reign of righteousness. And God said to Samuel in 1 Samuel 8 and verse 7, Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. And so Samuel follows God's instructions, and he anoints Saul as the first king of Israel, and he steps aside as the ruler. And you know, Saul was impressive. I mean, he was an impressive specimen. The Bible says he was a head taller than any other man in Israel. And he is one of 4 men that are mentioned in the Bible as being well-built and handsome. He was the desire of all of Israel. He was the people's choice. And he would have made a great political candidate in our country today. I mean, with his chiseled good looks and his tall stature, probably had a resonant speaking voice. I can just see his picture on the front of magazines and on posters and on television commercials. I mean, the soccer moms would line up to vote for him. And so he was the desire of all of Israel. And you know what? He starts out well. But eventually he rebels against God. Samuel counsels him, rebukes him, warns him, prays for him, weeps over him, sometimes all night. And Saul eventually no longer listens to Samuel, and Samuel no longer visits him. In fact, God even asked Samuel, how long are you going to mourn over Saul? Well, Samuel dies, and that brings us to our text here in 1 Samuel 28. Saul is with his army on Mount Gilboa, and gathering below in the valley are his archenemies, the Philistines. And King Saul leans on his sword, and he observes the gathering foe below, and he is somewhat panic-stricken. Now, Saul has never been a coward. He was a lot of things, but he was not a coward, and he was a mighty soldier. But this time he's intimidated. And one of the reasons that he's intimidated is because this time he's facing the foe without any kind of insight from God about how it's going to turn out. I mean, God's not talking to him anymore. Samuel's dead. He's not getting any kind of instructions from the Urim and the Thummim, from the breastplate of the high priest. I mean, there's no guiding ray that's going to assist him. He feels like there's only one recourse, and that is witchcraft. And he wonders if maybe there's a necromancer in the land that could communicate with the dead and maybe give him some kind of inkling how things are going to turn out that day, the next day in battle. And he asked his men about it, and they tell him, yes, there's a witch that lives in Endor, and we've heard that she can communicate with the dead. Now, you got to keep in mind, this was against the law of Moses, and Saul himself had passed a decree that anybody that dabbled in witchcraft, sorcery, whatever, they would be executed. But now here he is, he's looking for one of them. And so he takes a couple of men, they make their way to Endor, and they find the witch. Saul disguises himself. I'm suspicious of that. I think she probably knew who he was a head taller than any other man in Israel. He was going to need more than a Lone Ranger mask. But he disguises himself. They go in, and he tells her, I want you to bring me up whomsoever I request. And she said, no, whoa, wait a minute. You know what Saul has said about all this. Well, you trying to get me killed? Is that what am I being entrapped here? And Saul reassures her, if you'll bring up whomever I request, he promises there'll be no harm that will come to you. And she says, whom shall I bring up? And I guess she felt like she had at her disposal anybody. Hey, what about Abraham? He was the friend of God. What about Moses? He spoke directly to God, face to face. What about Joshua? He was the greatest soldier and captain of them all. What about Gideon? I mean, he had beaten the host of the Midianites. Saul says, no, you bring me up Samuel. And I don't guess there was ever a more earnest, beautiful, moving, or pathetic request, even though it was uttered in a witch's cave. Bring me up Samuel. He's the one I want to talk to. Samuel, the prophet of God, the one who anointed me and kissed me, the one who gave me another spirit and turned me into another man. Samuel, who warned me, who rebuked me, who wept over me. If there's anybody that can help me now, if anybody can foretell my fate in the battle tomorrow against the Philistines, it's Samuel. Bring me up Samuel. God, not the witch, answered his prayer. And the witch actually sees Samuel arising from the abode of the dead. And she is terrified. And Saul says, what do you see? And she says, I see God's coming out of the earth. And he said, well, what do they look like? And she said, it's an old man, and he's covered in a mantle or a cloak. And he recognized the description as being Samuel. And he fell upon his face in reverence. Samuel said, why have you disturbed me to bring me up? And Saul answered, I am deeply distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God has departed from me and does not answer me any more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore, I've called you, that you might reveal to me what I should do. And Samuel responds in 1 Samuel 28, beginning at verse 15, why do you ask me? Seeing the Lord has departed from you, has become your enemy, and the Lord has done for himself as he spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you this day, and moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Whoa. Don't you know that sent a chill up his spine? That's the only sermon that the Bible contains that was ever preached by a preacher who's come back from the grave. I mean, excluding our Lord. The rich man in hell asked Lazarus that Lazarus might be sent from the dead back to preach to his wicked brothers, but in Luke 16, that was not granted. We're told that Abel speaks from the dead, but again, that's not the same thing. It's by faith. Moses returned from the realm of the dead, and he spoke only to Christ at the Mount of Transfiguration. And so this is the only sermon ever to be preached by a man who's passed into the realm of the dead, and what a sermon it is. You know, the wonderful thing about this sermon, though, is that we can call him up tonight. We can bring up Samuel tonight, and it's not out of a witch's cauldron. It's not the waving wand or incantation of woman with a familiar spirit, but it's by way of the inspired pages of the Old Testament. We can call up Samuel, and he can preach to us too. And I want you to notice just a few lessons that we learn from this great prophet. The very first thing that we learn from Samuel is the power of the prayer of a godly mother. Samuel was born in answer to the earnest, fervent prayers of a godly woman named Hannah. She prayed so earnestly in the tabernacle in Shiloh that Eli, the aging priest, dozing in his seat, thought she was drunk. She protested that she wasn't drunk, but she was saying that she was praying out of the abundance of her grief. She spent most of her time begging God for the gift of a son. And she vowed that if the Lord would grant her request, that she would give the boy back to him. And he did grant her request. And the Bible says that he gave her a son. She named him Samuel, which means asked of God. Notice it ends in El. El is one of the names for God in Hebrew. And anytime you see a name that has El in it, Hebrew name, there's going to be some reference to God in that name. And Samuel means asked of God. I have asked God for him. Joel ends in El. It means Jehovah is God. Emmanuel, it means God with us. Gabriel, it means God is my strength. Michael, it means who is like God. And so she names him Samuel because I asked God for him. And you know, soon after he was weaned, she fulfilled her vow and she took Samuel to Shiloh and she turned him over to Eli, the aging, almost blind high priest of Israel. And at that point, Eli became responsible for Samuel's welfare, his education. According to 1 Samuel 3 and verse 1, he was tutoring him in spiritual things, preparing him for a lifetime of service to God. How many other people can you think of, great men and great women in the Word of God, that were great probably because of their ancestors, their mother, their father? John the Baptist, he had parents that were righteous in the sight of God. There was Timothy. Timothy was the young man that he was because of the teaching and the prayers of his mother and his grandmother. Moses had a mother who was God-fearing and who had great faith. Samson asked the angel for advice about how Samson's parents asked for advice about how to rear him. Abraham Lincoln often thought about his mother, and he said that when she lay upon her deathbed in their rude cabin in Gentryville, Indiana, she called him in one day, and as she lay there, she put her hand on his head and she said, "I'm getting ready to go on a journey from which I will not return." And she said, "I want you to be kind to your sister, obey your father, and love God." Years later, Lincoln said, "All that I am or ever hope to be, I owe to my mother." President Grover Cleveland said essentially the same thing. He wandered early in life from the right path, but he said he returned eventually due to the persistent prayers of his mother. Who can estimate the power of a mother's prayer? And what the church needs today are more women like Hannah, who's willing to give her sons and her daughters back to God and then pray earnestly and fervently for them. There was a young man, he was probably 12, that obeyed the gospel, was a talented young man, had a lot of gifts, a good singer, had a good singing voice, and he was a good song leader. And I know that early on he traveled with at least one evangelist, and he would go with him on mission meetings and lead the singing for him, and just seemed to be doing so well. But he got on up into his later teenage years, and his attendance at worship services became a little more inconsistent, and eventually he just quit altogether. And he got married young, and he had 3 children immediately. And you know, at that point, he hardly thought about spiritual things, hardly thought about the church. He's more concerned about making a living for his family. And you'd see him and maybe mention that we sure miss you at church, and we wish you'd think about things and get your family back in the church and so on. And well, he had a hot temper, and he had a hairpin trigger on it. Boy, he'd fly off the handle. He'd jump all over you. And he told me one time, he said, "You know, I'm not sure if I ever really believed in God." And you talk about a reprobate condition. But I don't guess there was a night that his mother went to bed that she didn't pray for his sorry hide. She prayed that God would spare his life, that God would orchestrate circumstances maybe that would make him more sensitive to eternal things and spiritual things. And when he was 40, he was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on his job and had a bad case of heartburn. But when he got back home, he went to the doctor, and the doctor ran a bunch of tests. He said, "Man, you've had a heart attack." And it scared him. And you know, for the first time in a long time, he began to realize maybe he wasn't going to live forever here in this realm. He began to think about the possibility of death, and he began to think about spiritual things and eternal things. And he would call me from time to time with a question. Or he would call and he'd say, "Hey, who's got the lesson over there at church? I just might come on over. Oh, where are you going to be in a gospel meeting? Don't be surprised if I just surprise you and show up." Well, he never did. But in 1976, Phyllis and I were in San Angelo, Texas, in a gospel meeting, and there was a gospel meeting going on at home that exact same week. You know, you try to avoid that, but when you schedule years in advance, sometimes it's inevitable that they will conflict. And we were down there, and the meeting was going on at home. My folks, both of them were still alive, and of course this was way before cell phones. And I used to call home maybe a couple of times during the week and check on my family. And I called home on a Wednesday night, best I remember. And my mother answered the phone, and she was beside herself. She said that fellow actually came to worship services that night. He was there. They couldn't believe it. And she said when the invitation song was led, he hit the aisle and came down to the front. He confessed his sins, that he had been out of the church, turned his back on God. He wanted the prayers of the faithful, and he wanted God's forgiveness, and he was restored. And my mother was ecstatic, and so was I, because that was my oldest brother. He lived about another 16 years, and he died at the age of 62 with leukemia. But I don't know of anybody in that 16-year interval that was more faithful, more devout than he. And I have every confidence that he will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. But you got to wonder what the outcome would have been had it not been for the earnest, fervent prayers of our mother. What the church needs are more women like Hannah who will give their children to God and then pray earnestly and fervently for them. Something else that we learn from this narrative, 1 Samuel 1 and verse 11, is the importance of keeping vows. Vows are serious business. And Solomon tells us here that God does not suffer fools. Let that sink in for just a moment. Vows are a very serious thing. It is a solemn promise to God. Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, beginning at verse 2, "Do not be rash with your mouth. Let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. And when you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it. For he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. It's better not to vow than to make a vow and not pay it." We make vows all the time. If you're married, you have made a vow to your mate and a vow to God, and you'd best keep it. When I was 18 years old, almost 19 years old, my mother and I were traveling, went down to Healdton, Oklahoma, about 80 miles from where I live in Ada, Oklahoma. And I had a 1957 Chevrolet, be a classic today. I didn't know anything about cars, honestly. I didn't grow up, around cars. I didn't know anything about cars except I knew I needed one if I was going to date successfully. And I got that car and I got me a girl. I married her eventually. But anyhow, my mother and I were going to have to go down to Healdton, Oklahoma. I had just bought a new set of tires for that car from one of my brothers-in-law, and they were essentially racing slicks. I didn't have a clue that you're not supposed to drive a car with racing slicks on a wet highway, and it was pouring down rain. And we made it down to Sulphur and then over to Davis, and we were driving on Highway 7, west out on Highway 7, and we were coming on a 2-lane asphalt highway, and we came to a concrete bridge, and there were ripples in the asphalt where the traffic would slow down to go across the bridge. Pouring down rain, I hit those ripples and my car hydroplaned, and I crashed front left head on into that concrete bridge. It spun the car around. It threw my mother out on the side of the road, and it knocked me out. I was unconscious for a while. And when I woke up, I was standing in the middle of the highway. First thing I heard was my car. I heard the fan hitting the radiator. And I looked, and my car was pointing up in the ditch, and it was on up the road a little ways, and the front of it pointing upward. And I turned and I looked, and I saw my mother crumpled on the side of the road in the rain, and she was covered in mud. And I didn't know whether she was alive or dead. But I ran to her, and I picked her up, I wiped her face, and I prayed, and I made a vow to God. I said, if you'll let her live, I'll devote my life to preaching the gospel. Well, she lived. But in the aftermath, as I reflect back upon it, I'm not sure God's in the deal-making business. I'm not sure you can say to God, hey, I will, if you will do this, I will do that. I'm not sure he's in the deal-making business. My mother may have lived anyway. The only thing of which I'm absolutely certain is I made a vow. And regardless of how weak and unworthy my efforts may have been, I plan to keep it. It's better not to make a vow than to make one and not keep it. You know, we also learn here from Samuel about how to deal with adversity. When he was just a youngster, he was living in the tabernacle, and one night there was a voice that spoke to him and woke him up, called him by his name, and he thought it was Eli, the high priest. He thought, Eli was calling. He was in another room in the tabernacle, and he gets up and he goes in there and asks Eli what he wants, and Eli said, I didn't call you. He said, go on back to bed. Well, in a little while, somebody called his name again, and he got up and he went into Eli's room, and Eli said, no. That happened 3 times. And finally, Eli told him, he said, next time that happens, say, speak, thy servant heareth. And he did. And God spoke to him in 1 Samuel 3, verse 11, behold, I will do something in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. In that day I will perform against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I've told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them. And therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. Eli had 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and they were a couple of worthless reprobates. They stole from the tabernacle. People would bring the best that they had to be sacrificed to God, and when they would get it, they'd skim the best of it off from it and keep that for themselves, and then sacrifice whatever was left over. They sexually exploited the women who came into the house of God. And Eli knew all about it, but he did nothing. It was as though he folded his arms and he thought, well, I never could do anything with those boys. Hophni and Phinehas have always been rebellious, and I'm so busy, I got so many things to take care of, and surely God will understand. Well, God didn't understand, and God was angry. And so he woke up this boy in the tabernacle to tell Eli what was going to happen. Eli asked Samuel what God said. He said, I want you to tell me what he said. And he said, I don't want you to leave out anything. And Samuel laid it on him. And Eli's response is incredible. It was as though he said, well, that's the way it goes. God knows what he's doing. Wouldn't it have been better if he'd said, well, I've had it. That's enough. I'm going to do exactly what God says to do in the law. I'm going to take these 2 rebellious boys down to the elders of the city so that justice might be carried out. And the years of my own negligence and the evil in the tabernacle is going to end right now. And when I die, I'm going to die in obedience. Wouldn't that have been better? But no, instead, he does exactly what he's always done, nothing. That indicates right there that any family can come unraveled. I mean, an elder's family, a preacher's family, a missionary's family, a rich family, a poor family, a healthy family, a strained family, any family can become unraveled. And, the symptoms really are often very evident. Disintegrating families have parents who are preoccupied with an occupation to the exclusion of the needs of the family. Eli was a busy priest. He was a respected judge. He was engaged in public service, and he did a good job. But that wasn't his problem. His problem was that he failed to give his own sons the kind of attention that he gave Samuel. And therefore his own sons became cynical and skeptical, and Eli overlooked it, and he fails to discipline them, and yet he does his job well. How could they be born in Shiloh and reared in the tabernacle and not know God? Well, for one thing, their father was never home. And there is a real temptation for preachers' kids to see the church as just another occupation. They've got to understand, though, that this is not a business. This is not another slick profession. This is not an entertainment arena. When our families look at us, what they need to see is not perfection. Nobody gets it right all the time. But what they need to see is authenticity. They need to see genuineness. So we've got to be real, admit our faults, own them completely, ask for forgiveness, be quick to give it, allow our children plenty of room to fail, and then let them see us and our life behind the scenes with love, grace, and humor. And of course, all of that takes time, it takes effort. It'll probably cost you productivity on the job, but you consider it a priceless, permanent investment. Disintegrating families have parents who refuse to face the severity of their children's actions. Eli knew how horrible his sons had become, but he did nothing. And there are those tonight that are in such denial that they can't bring themselves to admit that their child has a serious problem with drugs, pornography, sexual promiscuity, or stealing, behaviors that really other normal people would consider a red flag. And yet they act as though the crisis, if they'll just be patient, will solve itself. Solomon says in Proverbs 19 and verse 18, chasten your son while there is hope, and do not set your heart on his destruction. Another says, discipline your children while there is hope. If you don't, you'll ruin their lives. Still another says, discipline your children while they're young enough to learn. If you don't, you're helping them to destroy themselves. Children are very impressionable when they're very young. And that's the time to make the most important investment in them. If you wait until they're as tall as you are, you've waited until it's too late. And then disintegrating families fail to respond quickly and thoroughly to the warnings of others. Listen to their teachers. They may seem biased against your child, but they rarely are. Take the early reports seriously. Get involved soon. Listen to elders, to preachers, to teachers, to church leaders. Listen to the uniformed police officer with a badge who comes to your door. And don't be too quick to jump to your child's defense. At least take the time to listen to the full report. Ask direct, hard questions to make sure you've got the whole picture. Take time to reflect on it. And then if it resonates, do whatever you have to do to get the thing resolved. Now, don't be impulsive, but at the same time, don't be like Eli. He didn't listen to the man of God who came to him, 1 Samuel 2 and verse 27, and he paid dearly for his negligence. And then disintegrating families rationalize wrong behavior, and thereby they become part of the problem. Eli knew what his boys were doing, and he knew that was grievous sin, and yet he got fat on the food that they stole from the house of God. 1 Samuel 2, verse 29. There's one other lesson that we learned tonight from the life of Samuel, and that is how to respond gracefully to rejection. You know, after he had served for 40 years, this delegation came to him, and they said, "You're an old geezer. You're out of touch. You don't know what's going on. We want you to step aside." Now, that'd be hard enough to take. But then they rubbed his nose in the fact, your own sons don't even believe what you believe. Your own sons don't even walk in the way that you walk. And I'll tell you what, that's a bitter pill to swallow for any godly parent. But you know how he responded? He didn't respond in kind. Instead of rebuking them and their foolishness in rejecting him, he reminds them of the mercies of God and tells them if they will just return in repentance, that God will be merciful. He says, "Only fear the Lord and serve him with all your heart." And then he adds, "As for me, God forbid that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you." Now, that's a man. I will confess to you, I don't think I could be that magnanimous. I would be prone to say something like, well, I don't think I would be that. I don't have it within me to be that gracious. I might have told them something like, "You bunch of reprobates, I hope you get what you deserve." No. He anticipates the Sermon on the Mount by the Lord, who said, "Love your enemies and pray for them that despitefully use you." The best way to bear adversity, to deal with those that have hurt us and have wounded us, is to pray for them. It'll take the sting out of the wound. And so Samuel, this great man, "As for me, God forbid that I should cease to pray for you." Well, in conclusion, this evening, the life of Samuel, who was brought up, tells us about the power of a godly mother's prayer, the importance of keeping one's vows, the possibility that anybody's family can come unraveled, and how to respond with grace to adversity and rejection. Possibly his most solemn message, however, is that life and opportunity soon come to an end.